Imagine this. You're a foreign ambassador in the year 1665, arriving at the royal palace of Madrid. You've been summoned to meet the most powerful monarch in Europe. As you walk through grand, gold-lined corridors and marvel at the splendor of the Spanish court, you expect to encounter a man of commanding presence, majestic, regal, unforgettable. And unforgettable he is, but not for the reasons you hoped. Instead, you're met with a grotesque figure. The king's jaw hangs permanently open, slack like a broken hinge. When he tries to speak, only slurred, garbled noises escape. His features are distorted, his body frail and twisted, almost monstrous. It's like a living horror carved into a throne. The courtiers call him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. But this wasn't sorcery, it was something far more sinister. Charles II of Spain wasn't cursed by witches. He was cursed by his own bloodline. This is the story of how the Habsburg dynasty, rulers of half the known world, collapsed under the weight of its own obsession with power and purity. A family so intent on keeping their empire in the family that they destroyed it from the inside out, leaving behind a broken king who would become the tragic catalyst for one of history's most brutal wars. To understand Charles II, we must first descend into the twisted logic of the Habsburgs, a dynasty that ruled vast swathes of Europe, from Spain to the Philippines, Austria to the Netherlands. Their empire was so vast they bragged the sun never set on it. But behind the gold and glory was a terrifying cost. Power, yes, but at the price of madness. The Habsburg dynasty wasn't just powerful, it was obsessed with purity, but not in the way you might think. To them, keeping the bloodline pure didn't mean marrying nobles from across Europe. It meant marrying each other again and again and again. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, and when the family tree got too tangled to track, they just added more branches to the same twisted trunk. Enter the nightmare that was Charles II. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, which for context is higher than what you'd expect if your parents were brother and sister. But Charles wasn't the product of a single generation of incest. He was the end result of 11 straight generations of marrying within the family. His family tree? It wasn't a tree at all. It was a genetic spider web, where you and I might have 16 unique great-grandparents. Charles had 6, and the titles get even more disturbing. Anna of Austria was his aunt, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Philip II was simultaneously his grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. Modern geneticists have confirmed it. Charles II had less genetic diversity than a child born of full siblings, but this wasn't accidental. It was by design. Spanish court records from as early as the 1500s show that royal advisors knew what was happening. Doctors warned of rising infant mortality, birth defects, and alarming physical deformities in Habsburg children. And the family's solution? Double down. Marry closer, eliminate outsiders, preserve the purity, even if it meant sacrificing health, sanity, and the future of an empire. The Habsburgs weren't oblivious to the consequences of their choices. They saw it, generation after generation. Children born with twisted limbs, speech impediments, and skulls that never quite formed right. The infamous Habsburg jaw grew more exaggerated with each heir. Some children couldn't walk until late childhood. Others suffered from infertility, seizures, or simply died without explanation. And yet, instead of stopping, they doubled down. Why? Because the thought of tainting the bloodline with an outsider was more horrifying to them than birthing generation after generation of sick, suffering children. They were willing to sacrifice their own descendants to preserve their illusion of power and purity. When Philip IV of Spain, father of Charles II, saw the extent of his son's deformities, he didn't call for doctors. He called for silence. He ordered all portraits of young Charles destroyed. No one outside the palace was allowed to mention his condition. To acknowledge the truth would have shattered the image of Europe's most powerful royal family. An image to the Habsburgs was everything. This secrecy only fed the nightmare. With each generation more genetically damaged than the last, no one could admit there was a problem, let alone try to stop it. And then came Charles II. He was born on November 6, 1661. But instead of celebration, the delivery room went still. Midwives didn't cheer. Bells didn't ring. Whispers, not joy, spread through the palace like smoke. Some thought the baby had been stillborn. His head was grossly oversized, his limbs underdeveloped, his eyes were wide set, almost alien, and his mouth, that infamous mouth, was already locked open in a slack, helpless gape. The very expression that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But the most terrifying part, no one dared speak a word. The midwives were threatened with death if they ever described what they had seen. The Habsburgs would rather rule in silence and sickness than let the world know they had created a monster, not by fate, but by choice. To the outside world, Prince Charles of Spain was healthy and strong. That was the official story, because the truth wasn't allowed to exist. Doctors were forced to sign sworn statements declaring the infant perfectly normal. The royal propaganda machine sprang into action, determined to bury reality beneath gilded lies. But inside the palace, the horror was impossible to hide. Charles's early life was nothing short of a waking nightmare. He couldn't hold his own head up until he was 6 years old. He didn't walk until he was 8. He didn't speak clearly until he was 10. Every basic developmental milestone, crawling, speaking, feeding, was a brutal uphill battle. The simplest acts of life became daily reminders of what centuries of inbreeding had done. But what made it even more devastating? Charles seemed to know. Court physicians wrote that the boy often wept for hours without explanation, as if he were trapped in a body that was betraying him. Constantly, mercilessly. He couldn't sleep. His malformed jaw prevented him from resting properly, and his oversized tongue would slip backward in the night, cutting off his breathing. Nurses were horrified. One by one they quit, terrified of the child they were meant to care for. Some were caught making the sign of the cross before approaching his crib. Others whispered prayers under their breath, too afraid to admit what they feared most. That this child was not just deformed, but cursed. Palace records from that time speak of a household consumed by dread. Servants drew lots to determine who would enter the young prince's room. No one volunteered. And the guards? They told stories of sounds in the night. Not cries, not wails, but something else. Something unnatural, distorted, inhuman. As if the palace itself had become a haunted place. When Charles turned 5, it was time for his first official royal portrait. The painter, Juan Carreño de Miranda, was summoned to the palace, expecting to capture the innocent charm of a young prince. What he found instead shook him to his core. Miranda was so disturbed by the sight of the boy that he initially refused to paint him. In private letters to his wife, he described Charles not as a child, but as something closer to a beast. He confessed that he had nightmares for weeks after the session. Still, duty prevailed. The final portrait was a masterpiece of illusion. Miranda used every trick of light, shadow, and brushstroke to soften the truth, to make Charles appear dignified, even regal, but despite his best efforts, he couldn't erase what the Habsburg bloodline had done. The most haunting feature, Charles's eyes. Miranda wrote that they held a startling awareness, as if an intelligent soul were trapped inside a failing body. The boy seemed to sense that he was different, that others feared him, but he didn't understand why. In response, the royal court launched an elaborate charade. Every public appearance was stage-managed to perfection. Ceremonies were choreographed, so Charles's deformities remained hidden. Special furniture was built to disguise his twisted posture. His meals were mashed into a soft, pastel-like mush so he wouldn't choke or drool in front of dignitaries. But children don't lie. When Charles was 7, an Italian ambassador visited the court and brought his young son. The boy took one look at the prince and screamed in terror, shouting, "Mostro! Mostro! Monster! Monster!" at the top of his lungs. The incident triggered a diplomatic scandal, but more than that, it shattered the illusion the Spanish court had worked so hard to preserve. No portrait, no performance, no whispered lie could disguise what Charles had become. Not a symbol of royal strength, but a living, breathing testament to the cost of power unchecked. The infamous Habsburg jaw wasn't just a quirky family feature, it was a genetic disaster, centuries in the making, and in Charles II of Spain, it reached its final grotesque climax. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that even with his mouth closed, a visible gap remained, wide enough to slide coins through. Modern doctors believe he suffered from severe mandibular prognathism, macroglossia, an abnormally large tongue, and possibly even acromegaly, a hormonal disorder causing abnormal bone growth. But 17th century witnesses didn't have clinical terms. They had metaphors and horror. One foreign diplomat described Charles's face as if it were sculpted by a vengeful god to punish the sins of a dynasty. The Venetian ambassador said his mouth hung open like a fish gasping for air. The French envoy compared his speech to the choking noises of a drowning man. Even Spain's allies were revolted, and nothing exposed the tragedy more brutally than mealtime. Charles couldn't chew. His upper and lower teeth didn't meet at all. His upper jaw sat completely behind his lower one. Solid food was impossible. Everything had to be pureed, mashed, liquefied. Soups, porridges, pulps, meals fit for a toddler, served on golden plates. Even then, eating was a slow, humiliating ordeal. Soup would dribble from the corners of his mouth. Chunks of food would fall out. Servants hovered nearby with cloths, wiping saliva from the king's chin, while dignitaries tried to look away. Royal banquets, meant to display wealth and power, became spectacles of pity. And Charles knew it. He was painfully aware of how his eating disgusted others. Palace records show that he often refused to eat in public. He would rather starve in private than endure the eyes of his court. This led to severe malnutrition, which only deepened his already fragile condition. But eating wasn't his only torment. Speaking was worse. His distorted jaw and oversized tongue made royal addresses an agonizing performance. His speech came out slurred, wet, and barely intelligible, a string of mumbles that even his most loyal courtiers struggled to interpret. And yet this was the man meant to lead an empire, the product of a bloodline that chose purity over survival. A crown on the head of a king who could barely eat, barely speak, and whose very existence was a living testament to his family's self-destruction. Foreign diplomats visiting the Spanish court didn't need interpreters for language. They needed them because no one could understand what the king was saying. Charles II's speech was so slurred, so garbled, that matters of state couldn't be conducted face to face. Negotiations, declarations, even simple greetings, all had to be done in writing. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a constitutional crisis. How could a monarch rule if he couldn't communicate with his subjects? Palace scribes worked day and night, trying to transcribe his mumbled speech into proclamations. But even they often had to guess what he was trying to say. And perhaps the most tragic voice in all of this was Charles's own. In rare moments of clarity, he put pen to paper, his shaky handwriting barely legible, to express the torment he felt being trapped inside his body. One surviving letter reads, "I am a prisoner in my own flesh, and God has made me king of the greatest empire on earth as some cosmic jest." The infamous Habsburg jaw was just the tip of the iceberg. Charles II's entire body was a masterpiece of genetic disaster. By the time he was 35, he didn't look like a grown man. He looked like a sickly child who had been stretched and twisted by something cruel and unnatural. He stood barely 5 feet tall, with proportions that defied logic. His head was massive, bobbing precariously on a neck too weak to support it. His limbs were long, stick-thin, and skeletal. His torso was oddly compact and hunched, like his body had tried to fold in on itself. And the worst part, he was getting worse. While most people stabilize after reaching adulthood, Charles continued to deteriorate. He was a man who aged in reverse, growing weaker, more misshapen, more dependent as time went on. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old. Let that sink in. Most toddlers are toddling by their first birthday. Charles spent almost a decade unable to support his own body weight. This was the king of the Spanish Empire, ruler of lands stretching across the globe, reduced to a whispering shadow, locked in a body that had betrayed him from birth, a living symbol of a dynasty's darkest legacy. When Charles finally learned to walk, it was hardly a triumph. It wasn't walking, it was a stumbling shuffle, more akin to a fragile old man than a king in his prime. Palace records describe him lurching from wall to wall, using furniture for balance, his movements unsteady and strained. His spine was so twisted, so severely curved, that he was permanently hunched, giving him the silhouette of someone carrying an invisible weight. And in truth, he was. The weight of centuries of genetic damage funneled into one catastrophically unlucky man. But his body wasn't the only battlefield. Charles's mind was just as broken. He didn't learn to read until he was 10 years old, and even then, reading comprehension remained painfully low. Court tutors described the experience of teaching him as like pouring water into a cracked cup. Information would enter, then vanish. Nothing stayed, nothing solidified. Emotionally, he was still a toddler, trapped in the body of a man and the role of a monarch. Servants reported terrifying tantrums, screaming, thrashing, throwing objects in fits of rage over minor frustrations, like a child denied his favorite toy, and then, just as suddenly, he'd fall into complete silence, sitting still for hours, unblinking, staring into nothingness like a ghost in his own body. And even his appearance betrayed the damage. Charles's hair grew in patchy, brittle tufts, falling out in clumps until his scalp resembled more a diseased animal's hide than a royal crown. He wasn't just physically deformed. He wasn't just mentally delayed. He was a walking testament to what happens when power, pride, and obsession override reason, love, and basic humanity. The Habsburgs wanted a perfect heir. What they created was a boy king locked in a body that failed him, inside and out. By the time Charles II reached adulthood, even the royal portrait artists could no longer hide the truth. They used every technique in their arsenal: soft lighting, careful angles, exaggerated proportions, to make him appear regal, dignified, worthy of a crown. But even their most flattering efforts couldn't fully mask what Charles had become. His skin was pale, almost translucent, marred by unexplained rashes that came and went with no pattern. Court physicians examined him endlessly, but found no cure. He was always cold, even in the sweltering Spanish summers, bundled in layers of thick clothing that distorted his already fragile, misshapen frame. And then there was the smell. Multiple court records reference it. Not foul exactly, but strange, unsettling, as if something inside him was rotting. Modern doctors believe this may have been the result of underlying metabolic disorders, the byproduct of centuries of inbreeding. But Charles's story wasn't just a personal tragedy. It became a continental crisis. The most powerful throne in Europe sat beneath a king who couldn't produce an heir. In a dynasty where bloodlines were everything, this failure wasn't just humiliating, it was catastrophic. Charles married twice, both times under enormous pressure to do the one thing a king was expected to do: continue the dynasty. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess, arrived in Spain expecting to marry a ruler, a sovereign, a man of strength and command. Instead, she found herself bound to what courtiers whispered was barely a man at all. The wedding night was reportedly a disaster of legendary proportions. Palace servants testified that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears. Charles, meanwhile, appeared confused, distressed, and helpless. The same twisted genetics that had warped his body had also robbed him of his ability to perform even the most basic marital duty. Doctors later wrote that Charles's reproductive organs were so underdeveloped they resembled those of a child, not a king. No heirs, no legacy, no future. What began as a desperate attempt to preserve the royal bloodline had come full circle, ending in a king whose body betrayed him, whose mind failed him, and whose reign would mark the end of a dynasty. Charles II had the sexual maturity of a child, a prepubescent boy trapped in a collapsing adult body. His underdeveloped reproductive system left him functionally impotent, but acknowledging that truth would have meant facing a political disaster of epic proportions. So the Spanish court did what royal courts have always done when power is threatened. They found someone else to blame, and that someone was his wife. Rather than admit the king was incapable of producing an heir, the court turned its fury on Marie-Louise of Orléans, the young French princess who had the misfortune of marrying into a dying dynasty. The whispers began. She must be barren. She must be cursed. She's withholding the future of Spain. What followed was nothing short of abuse. Wrapped in the false hope of medicine, Marie-Louise was subjected to humiliating, invasive examinations by royal physicians. She was forced to drink foul herbal brews, undergo painful fertility treatments, and endure the daily pressure of a court that needed her to do the impossible: bear a child with a man who was biologically incapable of fathering one. The psychological toll was enormous. Marie-Louise, once described as lively, intelligent, and full of promise, became a shadow of herself. She retreated into silence, spending her days in endless prayer, begging for a miracle that would never come. Some historians now believe she may have been slowly poisoned, not intentionally, but through the very fertility treatments and stress-induced illness inflicted upon her in desperation. The constant physical strain, the endless concoctions, the emotional isolation, it was a slow erosion of a young woman's life. In private letters to her family in France, Marie-Louise wrote of being married to a ghost. She described Charles as more pitiful than frightening, but impossible to love. When she died suddenly at just 26 years old, the official cause was listed as appendicitis. But behind closed doors, the theories whispered through palace halls: suicide, heartbreak, or simply the body of a young woman crushed under the unbearable weight of a kingdom's expectations. And with Marie-Louise gone, the Spanish court still had no answers. So they turned to something older than medicine, older than politics. When science failed, the Habsburgs looked to the supernatural, because how else could they explain a king who couldn't rule, couldn't speak, couldn't walk, and couldn't father a child? To them, Charles II wasn't just cursed by blood. He was cursed by something darker. What came next were some of the most bizarre, unsettling religious rituals ever performed on a living monarch: public exorcisms. Not whispered prayers behind chapel doors. These were full-blown spiritual spectacles staged in the heart of the Spanish court. The Catholic Church had a simple explanation for Charles II's condition. He was possessed by demons. Father Antonio Fernandez Dandera, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles was afflicted by multiple evil spirits, planted there through witchcraft aimed at destroying the Spanish crown. And the solution? Exorcise the king in public. These weren't private ceremonies of compassion. These were theatrical, brutal performances held in the throne room in front of nobles, courtiers, and visiting foreign dignitaries. Imagine the most powerful men in Europe forced to watch their monarch, their emperor, writhing on the palace floor, while robed priests screamed Latin incantations over his convulsing body. Each session began with Father Dandara forcing Charles to drink a revolting mixture of holy water and ground-up religious relics, bone fragments, dust from tombs, and bits of sacred matter. The king would immediately vomit, overcome by nausea, likely from ingesting what amounted to rotting, contaminated bone water. But the priests didn't see it as poisoning. They called it victory. "The demons are resisting," they cried. "This is proof the devil is being cast out." Charles would shake violently, lose consciousness, moan incoherently, and through it all, the clergy shouted that they could see evil spirits leaving his body. The ceremonies dragged on for hours. Charles, already physically broken and mentally confused, was pinned, prodded, and dragged through hell by men who believed they were saving his soul. Crucifixes were pressed against his skin until he screamed. Buckets of holy water were splashed over him again and again, and worst of all, he was forced to recite prayers in Latin, a language he could barely comprehend, even on his clearest days. It was spiritual torture disguised as salvation, a kingdom's last desperate attempt to save its broken king, not with medicine, not with compassion, but with fire, fear, and faith. Foreign ambassadors, hardened by war and diplomacy, described what they witnessed in the Spanish court as more disturbing than battlefield torture. The exorcisms were grotesque enough, but what came next was something out of a fever dream, a surreal blend of religious panic, superstition, and desperation. By 1698, the exorcists weren't just blaming Charles. They declared the entire royal palace to be cursed. Father Diaz, convinced that demons lurked in every corner of the royal household, ordered a full-scale spiritual purge. What followed was less like a ritual and more like a bizarre, apocalyptic yard sale. Servants were instructed to collect anything that might be contaminated by witchcraft. Personal belongings of deceased queens, gifts from foreign dignitaries, even chairs, rugs, mirrors, furniture suspected of harboring evil. These items were dragged into the palace courtyard and piled high into bonfires. Priests chanted exorcism prayers while the flames roared, sending thick, choking smoke into the sky. The smoke was so black, so acrid, that it could be seen from the heart of Madrid. Citizens flooded the streets, thinking the palace was under siege. In a way, it was. Not from enemies or revolutionaries, but from the ghosts of its own delusions. The royal court was literally burning its own possessions in an attempt to banish imaginary demons. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part, Charles believed it was working. With his childlike mind and deep-rooted fear, he was tragically susceptible to suggestion. When the priest told him the demons were being driven out, he'd smile with relief. For a brief moment, his pain would ease. He would sleep, he would eat, and then the cycle would begin again. Whenever his symptoms returned, and they always did, Charles would beg for more exorcisms, more rituals, more fire. He became convinced that his twisted body was the result of spiritual warfare, and that only increasingly extreme religious interventions could save him. A king, broken in mind, body, and spirit, reduced to chasing phantoms, burning his legacy to ashes, one exorcism at a time. In the final 5 years of his life, Charles II underwent over 50 formal exorcisms. Each one left him weaker, more confused, and more broken, but still he begged for more. He lived in constant terror, convinced that without relentless spiritual cleansing, the demons would fully possess his body and soul. The priests had given him a script, and he believed it. His suffering wasn't genetic, it was demonic, and so he suffered willingly. But no amount of holy water could undo the truth. Because Charles II wasn't cursed by demons, he was cursed by his own dynasty. The House of Habsburg had spent centuries chasing genetic purity in their quest for eternal power, marrying cousins, uncles, nieces, and even closer bloodlines, believing they could preserve control by keeping it in the family. They were catastrophically wrong. Their final king was not a ruler. He was a fragile, broken monument to their arrogance. When Charles II died, alone, trembling, and barely able to speak, his body finally surrendered to the damage it had carried from birth. His autopsy would shock even hardened physicians. His internal organs were so misshapen, so malformed, that they appeared to belong to multiple different species. His heart was tiny, his lungs diseased, his intestines twisted, his brain underdeveloped. It was the final grotesque truth of a family that had tried to outwit nature and lost. But Charles's story isn't just a royal tragedy. It's a universal warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when the pursuit of power overrides common sense, when control is valued more than health, when myth is placed above biology. The Habsburgs believed their bloodline was sacred. They thought that mixing it with lesser blood would weaken their rule. But in the end, it was their refusal to adapt, to change, to let fresh life in, that killed them. And Charles II, mute, malformed, and dying without an heir, paid the ultimate price for their delusion. Today, the story of Charles II might feel like a relic of the past, but the pattern, it still exists. In isolated communities that shun outsiders, genetic disorders thrive. In elite circles where families marry only within their own class, harmful traits repeat across generations. The lesson remains the same. Genetic isolation leads to biological collapse. Charles II's broken body was evolution's verdict, its final ruling on the Habsburg experiment. Nature didn't whisper its judgment. It shouted it, carving its message into twisted bones, malformed organs, and a jaw that could not close. And here lies the cruelest irony. Charles II was the most pure Habsburg, yet he was also the most powerless. Centuries of tightly controlled bloodlines had created a monarch who could not rule, could not eat, could not speak clearly, could not reproduce, a king who could barely exist. In their quest for the perfect heir, the Habsburgs had forged the perfect contradiction. A ruler so biologically compromised that he became the living proof of their failure. Not the culmination of greatness, but its complete erasure. When you see portraits of Charles II hanging in museums today, know this. You're not just looking at a king. You're looking at the physical embodiment of human arrogance. A monument to what happens when power is placed above biology, above reason, above nature itself. His features, distorted and tragic, stand as a permanent reminder. No amount of wealth or empire can defy natural law. The Habsburgs learned this far too late, and Charles II paid the ultimate price with his body, his dignity, and the extinction of his dynasty. The most powerful empire in Europe collapsed not from war or invasion, but because its rulers forgot they were human, subject to the same biological truths as the peasants they ruled. In the end, evolution had the last word, and that word was written, painfully and irrevocably, in the deformed flesh of the last Habsburg king of Spain.